Thank you so much, Nikki. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Great. Um, that was a really amazing speech. So Nikki brings a lot. One of the reasons why we had Nikki to speak is that part of what she brings is this very deep understanding of history. And we've had a discussion about that several times of how history really impacts our actions today. And the lack of understanding of our common history impacts our actions or inactions today. And I'd like to dive back into that a little bit before answering some of the questions I see here in chat. But one of the things you were mentioning in an earlier conversation was, for example, during all the turmoil that we've seen this summer, there was a lot of people that spoke up and said, well, why can't our protesters today protest like King and Gandhi did back in the days? They were peaceful protesters. They didn't burn and loot, and they didn't destroy. They were completely peaceful. And we talked about placing that into historical context. And we were talking about how radical that concept was back then. Do you want to elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah, totally. So it's often always said, right, that, oh, Dr. King was so peaceful. But if you go back to that time frame, if you read newspaper clippings from that time frame, people were out of their mind about what he was doing. They thought it was over the top and super dramatic and asked him to find any specific other way than the way he was doing it to protest. And I also always go back to the fact that he did this peaceful act and he was still killed. So what does that say? Right? We will be looked at 20, maybe 30 years from now at how we didn't listen to Colin Kaepernick silently kneel, a very silent, small act. And then we progress to more and more acts. And then suddenly riots happening and rioting because it's as King said, it's the voice of the unheard. If you are not listening to me when I'm speaking to you in my gentle tone, then I must get louder, right? And so history has shown us that people will rework this, like, look how great it was once some progress has happened, right? But in fact, in his time, people were sending Dr. King death threats pretty daily. We look at Medgar Evers. He was shot and killed in front of his home, and he was doing the most peaceful thing, which was just trying to sign people up to be able to vote. So I always question, when you think about Dr. King, you're thinking about it from the place that we have all been taught, which is he was great and made change happen. But in that time period, people did not love and embrace him the way we do.
We have a question here from Eric Kent Benedict. He said, Nikki, this is so inspiring and memorable. I have a question. In many of our towns, most public action, even supportive ones, are in white spaces. And white people going to non-white spaces can feel like intrusion. Do you have any thoughts about the first steps white people who want to meaningfully support Black, Indigenous persons of color might take given those constraints?
Go to spaces and be there. That's it. Because this is a fight that is not going to be won, obviously, by just the minority groups fighting for it, because that term automatically states that there are not enough of us to make change. It has to be our white friends. It has to be our white brothers and sisters who come up and stand up. And so that means just go to those spaces. Ask, how can I help? What can I do? Engage in community affairs where that you have other like-minded people that can make change happen. Like there's Surge in Boston, and that's a white group that's helping to have activism and show people how to be activists. Diversity Institute, there's always these conversations that you guys are putting out to like really get people engaged in the topic. So share that out, bring people in, gain numbers, right? Just put yourself there. Everyone wants you there. That's the other thing. I think a lot of people are like, oh, people don't want me to be there because I'm white. But actually, no, come. I want you to learn about my culture. I want you to learn about my oppression. I want you to help me. And the only way you can do that is if we become friends. So come on in, right? Come hang out.
Another question that I wanted to ask you too is we talked a little bit about white people having a tremendous amount of power. And we talked a little bit about how you think that it's pushed upon us that we shouldn't be using or exercising this power of influence. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because I'm curious myself.
Yeah, so I know that a lot of people push back on this idea of white privilege, right? People hear that and suddenly they shut down. I am not from a space of privilege. What do you mean? But in fact, you have so much power. It's not a negative. It is a moment where you can say, I'm going to start questioning the people at the table that I'm sitting at about why there are not other people who do not look like us or think like us or bodied like us in this space, who not identified like we do. So there's this idea of, for me anyway, of allowing and telling people it's okay to know your privilege exists, but it's how you're using it in order to make things better. And that could be simply at work. That could simply be at the gym that you go to. I know I was a real big fan of a boutique workout, and I started to notice that there were no brown women using it. And I'm like, so why is that happening? Why are there not more? And so I kept questioning that, right? And there eventually were people saying, oh yeah, that's really weird. So it's just giving that small question of how do we bring in other people so that they can feel like they're a part of this as well, that will start actually getting change to happen and organically happen.
How do we get these instances of history? How do we get people to hear about it? I was in PR last weekend, and I was listening to an interview that the moderator had with Ruby Bridges, who's coming out with her new book about her experience integrating into a New Orleans school. And of course, I think many of us have heard of or read, have studied or been educated on the story of integration and Ruby Bridges in grade school, middle school, whatnot. We never learn the details. I was absolutely flabbergasted to learn, and the interviewer Ruby was as well, to learn that not only did she have to go through the gauntlet of hate to actually walk into the school and be escorted, of course, by the National Guard, but she was the only kid in the school that day. She actually was taught in the classroom by herself because 500 children who went to that school got up and left, and very few came back that day. How do we know? How do we hear about this type of history? And the other thing too that I was struck by is that no teacher would teach her from New Orleans. They had to bring a teacher from Boston to come and teach Ruby.
Yeah, and that's Ruby's story, and it's I've heard Ruby speak, and it's real. And this weekend was the anniversary of her being integrating into schools. It is a very different story when you hear the fact that there is someone every day, there were groups of people every day outside of this little girl's school holding a baby casket with a doll that looked like her. And that's what she walked by every day of her education, 180 days, right? We don't talk about that. We don't talk about the ugly that this child had to go through and how that changed her. So I'm always challenging people, what part of the history book isn't there? What part of the English, who's in your English curriculum that could be taken out and a new voice put in? And I really strongly believe that it starts with our schools. It starts with us as parents and what we bring into our kids' lives, right? Who do you only pick books that show a child that looks like them, or do you show a window into someone else's world? Ruby's daily experience of having to go through that, and also to hear, so there was like 5 kids that were next door that she could hear learning with another teacher. So that also there's that psychological break of she's by herself with a person who has to be shipped in and bussed in to teach her, right? And so why don't we talk about those parts of the story? Why do we glorify it just like we glorify that everyone loves Dr. King, right? We don't talk about the ugly with Dr. King. We only talk about how there was a change or movement happening. So it really starts with addressing your schools and really asking them to put into the curriculum the full story, the full picture. If it's a little tiny picture inside that history book, so then as a teacher, you should teach only that tiny picture in the history book, not the big pictures, because that's the part that kids need, because that's the gap that you're not going to be able to fill with that book.
Do you have books that you recommend for people just trying to learn a little bit more about language, about beginning to be active, history? Yeah. Let us know. We'll put it into the chat.
I love Stamped from the Beginning. I think it's super dense and there's so much information. It can get super overwhelming when you're reading it, but it's so worth the ride because it really does. It explains all those little boxes that are not in your history book or your English book. I'm also a huge fan of Isabella Wilkerson. And so her book, Caste, is a great way to look at how our economic and slavery are very similar to the one in India, as well as her Warmth of Other Suns book, which talks about the migration. And I always find it best to find stories that elevate history. And I know that sounds crazy, but I want to know the historical facts. I want to know what actually happened. And so those are the 3 books. I think if you start there, those are your new textbooks, right? Like this is your like history 101, non-whitewashed. Here it is. Learn about the things that really actually impacted the country you live in that you didn't know of. You know, I believe there was a study that was done recently by the Sovereign Poverty Line, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where most students who graduated 5 years ago did not realize that slavery was actually the reason for the Civil War. They thought it was only money. So that conversation that money was actually a human being's body was never clarified enough for them to be able to say it was slavery. So we have a lot of work to do, and we have to start by ourselves and then spreading it to the children who are going to take over this country for us one day. And, you know, when we're in our like old rockers, when we're old, that they're going to make it totally fine. We're all going to be happy. But the only way is to get them to know the real truth of everything that's happening around them.
So we have a question from John Carr, and I'm going to sort of paraphrase this question. But his question is, how do we get more Black and brown peoples to come and live in Needham? And I would say towns like Needham. There are a lot of beautiful suburbs that exist all around Massachusetts. And this beauty is exclusive to persons of color. How do we bring them in? What kind of initiatives do we need to put in place? Any recommendations? The third part of the question is, any recommendations on what one person, say like a white male, can do? And I can break that down.
Yeah. I mean,
you're done.
System, right? So is it a place that I would want to live? You know, and so that's the first question. You're asking for brown people to come, but is it a place I want to live? Will I be able to walk into Target and find a product for my hair? Or am I going to have to go to Amazon and ship that out? Am I going to be able to find the food that I traditionally eat from my culture, or am I going to have to find someplace else to go? So the first thing is making sure that your environment is one where people who are different, who are BIPOC, will feel like they can actually live there, right? And so that, as silly as it sounds about my hair, I have to drive to Worcester to get my hair done. And I live in Leominster, right? Because there's no place in Leominster that can do my hair this way. So it's those small little pieces of that. First, the person has to feel like they can, is to question what's stopping, right? Is it social economic? Is it awareness? How are homes being marketed? Where are they being marketed? Is someone pushing back on equal housing? So there was a couple of nights ago, there was on PBS, there was a short show. Well, it was a 30-minute show, but there was a short segment about equal housing and people wanting to support that. And they were actually in Texas, I believe. And the white woman says, well, I'm not racist. I really want people, but they don't have, you know, I'm not into single moms. I don't think they have the same morals or thoughts that I do. So if you're bringing brown people into your community or BIPOC people into your community, are they going to be met with people who will openly say, you don't have the same ideologies as I do because you're a single parent? Not even questioning, why are you a single parent? Could it have been a widow? Like, we have no idea, right? So these are all the questions that before we start bringing people in, we need to make sure that that space is actually safe and one that they can thrive in. So once you figure that out, then you need to start talking to your real estate agent. How are you bringing people in? Are you doing the most you possibly can? Talk to your banks. Are you doing absolutely everything you can to ensure that we can bring in people who are different? Are we causing different social economic or letting different social economic places come into our community? And are we okay with that we might need to support? Our taxes might go up, but this is for the greater good of our community. So those are all hard conversations that if you're ready to take on, go for it. I highly encourage you. But that's really where the change is going to happen, is really opening up to the fact that every neighborhood should have different social economic abilities within it for it to actually thrive.
Question from Amy Hurley. She said, Nikki, thank you. She said, I'm curious, did you leave the gym or stay?
Oh, I left.
Where did you go?
I ended up buying a Peloton. That way I know it's always diverse in my gym.
What would have happened if you had stayed though? What would you have done?
I think I would have been a lot louder. And, I say that because I am loud and I push back and I ask hard questions to people and I stay until I get the answer that I feel like I'm okay with. I know that there were some changes being made, and I know a lot of, and I will say that I know a lot of boutique workout places are really starting to look at who their clientele is and also who their staff is. So I think that there's been a great change in that. Even with Peloton, they've really identified the fact that they want to promote women of color on their platforms. So I think that's absolutely phenomenal, but it can't be a one-off. It has to be consistently looking at how you hire, how you market yourself. Are you making everyone feel like they can come in and take a class, or join, or even afford membership? Because that's the other thing about boutique, workout classes, is that there's a level of social economics that plays, right? There's a level of monetary that some people can't make happen. So how do you market it so that everyone can feel included again?
Great. I guess the last question is a question from me. I'm just curious because you are the program director for the Robbins House in Concord. And until I spoke with you, I didn't realize that Concord was such a hotbed of abolition and anti-slavery activism. And it's, I think I've been to Concord. I'd be curious how many people have been to Concord and didn't know this. And I still go back to the same conundrum that I have is why don't we promote this? I mean, how can we get the city of Concord to celebrate this rich history? I mean, we have I don't know if the audience knows, but we have notable figures like Harriet Tubman that has visited Concord and spoken there, Frederick Douglass, John Brown, several abolitionist figures that we all know, the Alcotts, the Louisa May Alcott family, the Emersons and the Thoreaus. How is this history? What would you like to see this type of history celebrated within each of our own town? I know in Needham, I think there was a house that no longer exists, but it did exist at one point in the Green Book Guide. Why do we have to dig to get this information?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what we're working on, right? Is that we have to start opening up and revealing the truths of location, right? In our proximity, like, where do we stand? When I walk into a space, or go somewhere new, I always look up who actually was here first. There's like a website, and I always say, what Native person was here first? Because it's not often just told to us. And it takes a little bit of digging, which it shouldn't, because it's just our history. It's our country's history. It's how we were formed. I think about like how much information and how people love talking about Alexander Hamilton, right? And the play Hamilton made everyone start digging into history. And then people started hitting that wall where they realized, oh, Alexander Hamilton owned slaves via marriage. And so then they kind of want to close that back up and then only just celebrate the good things, right? But that's the thing. They are human beings and they are gray. They did some amazing things. And there's some messy parts of them as well, but that's called being a human. And that would allow us all to understand, I'm going to make some mistakes. I have to own those, and then I'm going to make it better. So I think that that's really where we are, is that we're still not very comfortable with saying or acknowledging kind of those ugly gray parts, but those ugly gray parts are normal. That's called growing. That's called, being a human being. I think every town should do a BIPOC history for itself, through your library, through your schools. I know in Concord, they have the Rivers and Revolutions group, and they do a lot of history about what actually happened in the town that people don't know about. So really, libraries and schools are the way to go to be able to find documentation of all these things. And then also just talking about it. So have a group gathering where you say, hey, let's look at this letter that's from someone, a person of color, talking about like, it could be as small as planting. Like, a lot of things about farming are in New England. And so like, there's a lot of records of farming. So let's just read this, and really discovering who lived on that land and then celebrating it, right? Finding out why and how you can like amplify their story and tell their legacy. I always find it crazy that we live in Boston-ish area and there's no Crispus Attucks Day, and he was the first person to die for the freedom of this country. Black male. We don't talk about that, right? We don't have a Crispus Attucks Day. We have a Patriots Day. We don't have a day for the man who was the first person shot for the revolution. So again, these are things we can do. We can make those happen, but we just have to kind of push it through and really talk about it and engage our like local political offices, our, you know, politicians, and say, hey, we want to do this. We want to put this on the books. We want to talk about it and make it part of our narrative all the time.
Thank you. I go back to what you said, which is get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And conversations like this can be very uncomfortable for many of us on both sides of the aisle. I have a question from Joe Adu. He said, if there's time, and there's time, I think this will be our last question. He says, a Black Needham resident, one of the challenges that I face when discussing issues of race is the issue of denialism. Many folks just don't think we have these issues here in Needham, and that makes it difficult for me to even engage sometimes. How do we continue having these conversations in our local communities when so many still don't think these issues are relevant to Needham?
That's a good one.
Or to any, I guess, any community.
Yeah. So I think that it's consistently talking about it. It's still engaging in the conversation and not letting their inability to know your truth change how you discuss your narrative. I find a lot of times when people don't believe something is happening, it's more of a reflection of their own vision, like their own vision of who or what they're seeing. And so sometimes that's hard, right? Like right now we're looking at a good chunk of a generation who has now kind of come to terms with the fact that I am white, I'm in this body, and maybe the things that I have gotten or have nothing to do with the fact that I'm amazing and have everything to do with my skin color. So who am I now? How do I interact with the world knowing that my advancing in life had maybe only a small amount to do with my actual ability and probably a lot more to do with my skin color, right? So we're also fighting that self-awareness, for lack of a better word. I would say do not stop talking about the incidents because people need to continuously hear, because in hopes of continuously hearing, they will try to change and help change happen and then start speaking up. So the more people that come out and talk about it, the better off your community is going to be.
One last question, then we'll wrap up. And this is from Tincia Solari. What advice do you have for public school teachers who might be afraid of parent reactions if they teach difficult topics like LGBTQ history, issues, or anything about racism?
Yeah, so I'll give a little bit of story. This probably will take the whole time. I'm sorry. So I'm going to answer this question in a roundabout way. So before I was at Chapel of Chauncey Hall, I was at a school that did not talk about racism in the way it should have. Kids were ready. Teachers were ready. Parents were not ready. Heads of the school were not ready. They were not engaging in the conversation. That is where your real ally is your head of your school, your principal. And if you can prepare your principals to feel like they can handle that conversation, you are completely gold, as I like to say. If a principal or superintendent doesn't feel like they can handle those conversations of pushback, they're going to push back onto you. So I always say, invite or find PDs that you can say, hey, Superintendent K, come with me and can we do this PD together? So that they can start feeling comfortable about these conversations. At the end of the day, though, you have to do what's right by the student. And what's right by the student is educating them with a full picture of what that topic is. And if parents push back, the other option is to actually offer a parent class. And I have found that to be really helpful, is to say, hey, we're going to start talking about this next week with your class. Let's have a small, when we could get together, I'd bring people into the classroom. But now you could probably do it with Zoom, which actually might be even more effective. And just give the parents a one-on-one class about what you're about to teach and get them comfortable with the terminology, get them comfortable hearing about it. Because then when their kids come home, they can feel comfortable engaging in those conversations. I know as a parent, I hate looking at a math problem and being like, wait, what is that? Like, I feel so unprepared, right? Like, I'm smart. Why can't I do this? Right? So it's never a bad idea to also bring in your parents and say, hey, I'm going to teach this. Let's all work together, parent, teacher, together to make sure that our students know what they need to know.
Great. Nikki, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
We'll love spending the time with you. Thank you to everyone in the community, and thanks to all the questions that did come through. I guess we will turn this back over to Gretchen and Rebecca Drill now, and you can take the spotlight off Nikki and I. And again, thanks to everybody.